But all that wealth and power then goes to our head in the age of decadence, and we see a series of financial bubbles, right? We have the dot-com bubble. So I'm saying this is starting at around 2000. The dot-com bubble, 2008 crisis, COVID precipitated a financial crisis all of its own. Housing costs have skyrocketed for young Americans. And then we have all the social maladies, of course, the decline in religion, although maybe that's hitting a turning point here. All right, welcome to episode 3 here with Adam and Christian of ThinkingWest. Today we'll be talking about how empires rise and fall according to Sir John Glubb, written about in his essay called The Fate of Empires. And very relevant for our time, as Glubb claimed empires last about 250 years on average. As we all know, the USA is approaching its 250th birthday next year. And so what does that mean for us? But first, let's talk a little bit about who Sir John Glubb was, so we know what informed his essay here. He was born in 1897, so pre-20th century by a few years. His father was an officer in the Royal Engineers, a position to which he would grow up and later take on himself. And the most important thing to know about him is that he's a very well-traveled man. He spent several years as a child in Mauritius and went to school in Switzerland. So his mind was generally open to a broader world very early. And his career was largely one of a military and foreign service nature. So he joined the Royal Engineers like his father in 1915. He served in World War I in France and Belgium, being wounded 3 times and receiving the Military Cross. So he's a military man and understood the military affairs very well. And he later served as an Iraq officer, so then an administrator under the Iraq government. And then he began some service to the Transjordan government, which is now Jordan, and for 17 years commanded the Jordan Arab Legion. And it's only in retirement that he really turned to writing, for which he's most well known. So he published 17 books, mostly centered on the Middle East, and lectured widely in Europe and the United States. And so overall, Glubb has a great view of both Europe and the Middle East, due to his many travels and a good military sense. He might not understand the Americas or East Asia as well. Nonetheless, he's better positioned than most to study empires, as he was inculcated in Western and Middle Eastern history throughout his career. With that background out of the way and a better understanding of who Glubb was, let's now look at his big ideas that he's most famous for, as he wrote about in his Fate of Empires essay. So Adam, can you lay out the main points of the essay so we can get a sense of what his main ideas were?
Yeah, so in the essay Fate of Empires, Glubb really is laying out a pattern for the life cycle of these empires. And it's important to note that this life cycle does not necessarily apply to nations or smaller forms of government, but really these are superpowers. So he defines empire as a great power, similar to how we define a superpower today. So it's something that exerts its power in the region and isn't confined to just its own borders. And despite the many variables that empires can be shaped by, whether it's technology or geography, Glubb's important point here is that they all generally have the same life cycle and even the same lifespan, give or take a few years. So he sets 250 as the average lifespan of an empire. And like I said, changes in technology or the shape of these empires, I should say the geography of these empires, does not change this. You could have land-based empires like the Mongols. You could have sea-based empires like Great Britain. And these both vary in terms of technological levels. He has a quote, basically, the British Empire was fought with cannons, or it was forged with cannons and ships, whereas the Persian Empire was forged with spears and shields. However, the lifespan of each was roughly equivalent. And the reason for this is that Glubb claims the real yardstick for the lifespan of an empire is the human generation. So he says, for whatever reason, it seems that these empires tend to last roughly 10 generations, which is where he comes up with the 250-year span. One generation is about 25 years, so 10 of those, 250 years.
Right. And it's at that point in the essay that I began thinking of the Strauss-Howe theory, which is pretty popular today in a lot of podcast circles and this kind of space. That's the book, more well known for the book about it, called The Fourth Turning, which talks about smaller generational cycles of 85 years. So in that book, they describe 4 generations in the rise and decline of a society. It's not necessarily tied to an empire, so it's not necessarily limited by the size or power of a country, but it is generally talking about the U.S. and Western history in general. So in that book, they talk about the 4 cycles being: 1, the high, which is you're coming off a fresh crisis, so institutions are reinforced and strong, though at the expense of individual liberty. And that high, the second generation after the high, moves into the awakening, which kind of awakens the ideals of personal liberty. They're tired of the social discipline and stifling by the institutions. So they more or less overturn them, or at least weaken them, in a bid to become more true to themselves. And then the third generation, so each generation being about 20 years, if you do the math, right, is the unraveling. And this is when institutions are at their weakest while individualism reigns supreme. And so the society at this stage seeks individual fulfillment for the most part. And it's here that the cracks in the social cohesion is observed. So there's increasing crime, culture war, social dysfunction. And a lot of these things are similar things that Glubb will be talking about in his stages, but it's all condensed into the smaller 85-year cycle in the Fourth Turning. And then the climax of the book is the crisis, which is the most interesting part for most people, as of course they try to tie it into modern times. But it's in this that we see the destructive action brought about by the powers of the unraveling. So it's commonly marked by wars, revolutions, and political turmoil. Institutions are then have to be remade to defend the nation against external threats. And so all this kind of ties into the Glubb cycle in some way, though. And Glubb particularly applies the thinking about generations and things to to an empire, whereas Strauss and Howe applied it more widely to Western civilization, U.S. history at large. So one thing that was interesting thinking about that is that the 85-year cycle, if you run through about 3 of those, you get to Glubb's 250-year lifespan of an empire. So just something to think about as we move forward, that maybe there are some places where these cycles can fit together and mesh in that kind of way, and maybe they reinforce each other to some degree.
Right. Yeah, and Glubb, as you noted, I mean, he's continuing this tradition of thinking about history in a very cyclical manner. He's certainly not the first to do it, but I think what makes him unique is how structured his pattern is that he lays out, and his theory that each empire follows such a strict lifespan of 250 years. And I'll just lay this out here. He has a chart in his essay where he lays out 11 different empires that he's studied and the duration that they lasted in years. And it's notable that he only talks about empires that he personally studied. He notes that maybe there are 24 to 25 great empires throughout world history, but many of these were in Asia and South America and Africa, and he didn't personally study those, so he did not comment on them. But just to give you an idea, here's the empires and their durations in years. So he has the Assyrian Empire lasting 247 years, the Persian lasting 208, the Greek Empire lasting 231, the Roman Republic 233, Roman Empire 207, the Arab Empire 246, the Mamluk Empire 267, Ottoman Empire 250, the Spanish Empire 250, Romanov Russia 234, and Great Britain exactly 250. So it's a remarkable pattern of 200 to 267, I think, is the longest. So it's a very strict pattern he has there. And one thing to note is that the dates of the start of the empire and the end of the empire are somewhat arbitrary. It's obvious that empires generally don't start in one day or even one year, and they don't end so abruptly. So the dates you pick for the start and end are certainly up for debate. And this is probably the main criticism he gets, is that the dates he picks, it almost seems like he's biasing them towards his 250-year pattern so that it fits the cycle.
Yeah, I think if I could jump in there too, one other criticism I was just thinking about was that, to some degree, he might be leaving some out too. Like, there's an argument to be made for the Holy Roman Empire to be represented here to some degree. At least, they dominated Central and Western Europe for sure. And there's no representation for that. And what caught my eye and what made me think of that is that there's, more or less, there's an empire covering just about every period from, 1000 BC through today. But I noticed there's a large gap between 800 and 1250, right? The Arab and Mamluk empires. It's 400 years where apparently there's no main empire in at least the Middle East through Europe, which seemed a little strange to me. So maybe part of the criticism there would be like, maybe he's somewhat down selected for the ones that do fit this bill, since the Holy Roman Empire could be argued would have far outlasted the 250 years.
Yeah, the other empire that is mainly criticized is the actual Roman Empire. He certainly doesn't leave it out, but the dates he picks are certainly questionable. First of all, he divides it into the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire, which isn't that controversial. That's sort of the standard way of dividing the history of Rome. But the Roman Empire, he starts with Augustus in 27 BC and ends with the death of Marcus Aurelius in 180 AD, which is certainly a contentious date considering the standard time frame is, 27 BC to 476 AD. But his argument was that after the death of Marcus Aurelius, the empire was in such a state of confusion and disintegration that it was effectively dead at that point. Mm-hmm. And I see that, but it's certainly a stretch. Nonetheless, despite his somewhat contentious dates that he gives, I think the overall pattern that he lays out is really intriguing and informative about how empires develop and ultimately die. But I'll quote sort of a summary of what he's laying out here before we move on to the next topic. He says, any regime which attains great wealth and power seems with remarkable regularity to decay and fall apart in some 10 generations. The ultimate fate of its component parts, however, does not depend on its internal nature, but on the other organizations which appear at the time of its collapse and succeed in devouring its heritage. Thus the lives of great powers are surprisingly uniform, but the results of their falls are completely diverse.
Yeah, and one more comment on the, what he left out, or maybe there's wiggle room on those dates too, is that, okay, even if he did leave one or two out and maybe the Roman Empire is wrong by many people's opinion, even if the theory here is 90% right, that's great. That's still useful knowledge to have. And, if you apply the same accuracy to any scientific theory, historically, 90% accuracy is not bad. It tells you something in that theory is fundamentally true. Maybe not all the details, but for a political theory, that's extraordinary in my opinion. So I think it only gives Glubb greater credence there. But all right, now let's move into the actual 6 stages of the empire. Let's break down each one into its parts, and then after that, we'll move into maybe where we are today with the empire, with the United States. So the first age is the age of pioneers. This is what Glubb calls the outburst. So it's largely characterized by a fearless initiative. It's got enterprise, courage, hardiness. The people are tough, hard, and adventurous. And one characteristic of these conquerors is that they're usually not coming from wealth. There's a reason that they're pouring out into the neighboring lands of, say, another falling empire, or simply their equal neighbors. So these conquerors are usually poor. They're needing resources or land, perhaps. In the case of nomadic, say, Mongol tribes, they're conquering each other's lands for their grazing, for their herds, things like that. But with that kind of poor background and hardiness comes a readiness to improvise and experiment. So they're extraordinarily practical. They're willing to do whatever it takes to get their stuff they're conquering to work, right? They don't have any established traditions or norms to really follow. As Glubb says, they're uninhibited by textbooks or book learning, and action is the solution to every problem. And so it's by this outpouring that their distinctive characteristics are carried into their neighboring lands. So this is what carries their culture effectively into the rest of the world. And it is, this new power is largely forged on reckless bravery and daring initiative. There's not so much thinking about it as one might expect. It's not a well-planned invasion, maybe at the military level, but not at a strategic level. And so one of the things that greatly spurs this first outpouring is that a neighboring great power is usually in the declining stage. You can think of the Roman Empire in its decline. The various barbarian nations around them saw the writing on the wall and moved in to take advantage of it. So these new conquerors are, like the barbarians, are tempted by wealth and largely contemptuous of their decadence too. So there's also an element of jealousy in the conquerors. But at the same time, many of them also admire the empire which they might be consuming. So that's the case for the barbarians, who many of whom, for one, already became Roman, or at least many of their ancestors did. But many of them aspired to be Romans in many ways and adopted their fighting techniques and methods of law and religion. And so other examples besides Rome is the Arab expansion after Muhammad's death in 632, Spain's Reconquista and the world expansion in 1492, and Alexander's conquest. So that kind of wraps up the Age of Pioneers in a nutshell. And then after that, the age progresses into what's called the Age of Conquest. So Adam, why don't you spell that out for us?
So it's sometimes difficult to delineate between the Age of Pioneers and the Age of Conquests, because they both are in an expansive age. But what really defines the Age of Conquest is it's an increasing organization and discipline and professionalization of the fighting force, and an increase of overall sophistication of the government. So this is where I think the power becomes sort of defined as a bona fide empire. Before, it might be an aggressive state made up of sort of a ragtag alliance of peoples, but now it's unified, and it's a real fighting force, and other civilizations are going to start watching out for it. Often, as you mentioned, it's in the shadow of a larger civilization, and this is where often the new conquerors, they begin to adopt the methods of that larger civilization. So they might start to see some use in the forms of the declining empire. Now, it's still defined by a very practical leadership class and a very creative leadership class. So again, it still doesn't have this super long tradition to go back to. So the really movers and shakers of this conquering people need to be adept and adaptable. I think a good example of this stage is Rome during the Punic Wars, and maybe directly after the Punic Wars. So basically, before Rome and Carthage battled it out, there were two great powers in the region, Rome to the north, Carthage to the south, and it was a battle for domination of the Mediterranean, basically. Once they duke it out, there's only one surviving power, and that's the Roman Republic. And so now it represents the great power in the region. and it's kind of like the empire for that region of the world. And that's kind of what the Age of Conquest represents. It's becoming a bona fide power, and now it's the force to be reckoned with.
Yeah, I think another great example of when that ragtag, band from the Age of Pioneers becomes it kind of adopts the professionalism of its enemies is in the Revolutionary War. So in the United States specifically, right there, you have kind of a very disorganized army for the most part. We've all seen the movie Patriot and kind of have that in our heads as the style of much of the fighting. So kind of guerrilla warfare versus highly organized professional army. But by the time of the war of 1812, the United States has its own professional army and has adopted the same methods that of fighting that the British had at the time. So you kind of see that transition very quickly from 1770 to 1812 happening in the United States as well. All right, with that, we can move on to stage 3 of the fate of empires into the Age of Commerce. So this is the age, right? They've done a lot of their expansion. They've acquired vast territories under a single government now. And now they're going to use that land that they've acquired for commercial prosperity. They're going to grow rich off the resources that they've acquired. And this enables the commercial classes within the new society to grow quite rich. And because of that, there are great patrons available for art, architecture, and general luxury items. And so the interesting thing is that you quickly find yourself in a position where the culture of the new society is growing. It's creating new buildings of grandiose architecture, new works of art funded by the richer classes. So you have a great flowering of civilization coming from the Age of Commerce. And in this age, you still have, unlike some of the later stages, you still have a lot of the virtues on display. So it's kind of a golden age in a way. You have courage, patriotism, a sense of duty. The nation is united and full of confidence. And boys are still manly, something Glubb touches on in some of the later stages as not being true all the time. But this daring initiative into new forms and sources of wealth kind of is an evolution away from that same daring initiative that was witnessed in the Age of Pioneers. So it's shifted from an adventurous spirit into war and conquering, and transformed it into an adventurous spirit of gaining wealth. So there's new exploration in commerce, and it recalls a lot of that spirit from the Age of Conquest. We do, however, despite it being somewhat of a golden age in terms of wealth, art, luxury, general culture for the society, we do see a big shift in the later part of the stages where the cracks start to show. And this is where the overall greed of the society begins taking over. So the desire for making money begins to have an outsized influence on the public, and the wealthy merchant class begins to embody this pursuit. And so Glubb writes here, quote, "The proud military tradition still holds sway, and the great armies guard the frontiers, but gradually the desire to make money seems to gain hold of the public." And so slowly this honor culture that built the empire is being replaced by a mercantile one. And a great example is the British Empire in the 1800s. They are using their dominant sea power to expand their vast trade network. And so you get companies like the East India Trading Company coming along and exercising great power, but also generating great wealth for the nation. And so all that wealth is then growing until we come into what's called the fourth stage, the Age of Affluence.
All right, so the Age of Affluence really represents a shift in the empire. As you mentioned, the Age of Commerce represents a golden age. I think the Age of Affluence would also look like a golden age from the outside. However, internally, there starts to be a shift in mindset from, as you mentioned, an honor culture to a mercantile one, which is really a shift from service to selfishness. So what can I do for my country to now it's what can my country do for me? And of course, money is the real agent of this sort of declining phase now. What was once a strong and brave and courageous culture is beginning to rethink some of those fundamental assumptions that they had that made them strong in the first place. Whereas before, honor and glory were found in military conquests, now the young men of the period begin to look at trade and making money as sort of the highest thing one can do. They no longer have that voice of duty that tells them to help out the empire, expand the empire, make it greater. It's now what can I gain from the empire? So this leads to sort of a tendency towards pacifism, actually. So as the empire is wealthy and affluent, military readiness is not necessarily prominent. It's denounced as primitive or immoral. And the idea is that civilized people are simply too proud to fight. It's bad to be conquerors. We're beyond that as a civilization, and empires themselves are actually wicked. So though they are an empire, they might not define themselves as an empire. And of course, the problem with this is that there are many other nations that are not pacifist at the time. So though the empire might embrace this sort of rejection of military readiness, all the surrounding nations are still very militaristic usually. Now, the empire really just embraces a defensiveness. There's no longer the need to expand beyond what they have. It's more of defending what they already own. And a great example of this is Hadrian's Wall in the Roman Empire. So they basically gave up trying to conquer the Gauls north of the wall, and they said, okay, we're going to build this wall and we're going to defend what's inside, but we're not going to worry about expanding any further. We're content with what we have now. The glory of Rome doesn't need to be any greater. So let's just be content with what we have and enjoy the fruits of the labor of our ancestors, basically.
Right.
So it's sort of a resignation in the empire.
Yeah, and I think that dovetails perfectly into stage 5, which kind of begins to look inside itself, right? The empire is no longer looking beyond its borders, it's looking inside. So that leads us into stage 5, the age of intellect. And so this is where we begin to really see the vast expansion of the field of knowledge in this age. And it marks a new high water of human progress, at least in the minds of those in the empire. So it's generally marked by intellectualism, and it's good and bad. So they're both surprising advances in natural history and the sciences, technology, but it becomes somewhat self-absorbing as it's not looking outside itself anymore, much like people do when we begin to look inside ourselves too much and not to others in our own lives. And so one sign of this is that universities begin popping up everywhere, at least so long as the universities have been around, right? So the youth now seek credentials and academic honors. There's this credentialism where it's not so much the thing that the credential signals, it's the credential itself that's important. And so we definitely see a lot of that in our modern society now. But the biggest negative, according to Glubb, is not the credentialism or this kind of self-absorption, or at least in and of itself. It really comes from a subversion of action. And so there's a quote from Acts that Glubb writes in his essay, quote, "All the Athenians and strangers which were there spent their time in nothing else, but either to tell or to hear some new thing." And so it's this inward looking, it's looking for the new story, the new thing to talk about, the gossip of the nation, kind of distracts the people for the most part. So at the surface level, it appears that there's a lot going on. There's lots of discussion, debate, and argument. People are talking in the government assemblies. They're arguing in local committees. Thousands of articles, interviews, television, and podcasts. Endless talking like we're doing right now. All of this is happening, so it has the appearance of action, but there's no real action behind it. And so this constant talking subverts the action that is the thing that made the empire in the first place. So the age of pioneers was marked by lots of action, lots of momentum, lots of movement. And now in the age of the intellect, it's marked by talking about action, but not actually doing anything. And so one of the byproducts of this age and this idea is that the human mind can solve the problems of the world without any self-sacrifice or service, so that we can think our way out of our problems. We can think our way out of action. And certainly as we move into kind of a technocracy type society, we see that a lot. Although it's an open question whether we can operate this way or not. With robotics and AI, to some degree, we don't even have to do the thinking. And with robotics, we don't really have to do the action. So it's kind of a curious point we're in now that Glubb couldn't have likely foreseen in his lifetime. And then, so the next mark of this society is that with all the talking, there's a divide in the people. So there's the formation of interminable differences, intellectual arguments, all this talking, debate in the assemblies and the local committees. It rarely leads to agreement between the two parties, or there could be more parties, right? But in the American system, two parties generally. Public affairs generally worsen amid this endless argument, and there's an intensification of political hatred. And the sad thing is that there's typically no unite to save the nation at any point during the age of intellect onward, right? There's not hey, our civilization is being torn apart by politics, or being torn apart by, at this point, likely a declining economy. And there's no unite to save the nation moment when all the things fall apart, which is scary to think about today. So overall, in the age of intellect, there's this selfish, everyone's turned inward, and with that comes this loss of a sense of duty to the larger nation as well. And then Glubb writes here again, quote, "Indeed, it often appears in individuals that the head and the heart are natural rivals. The brilliant, by cynical intellectual appears at the opposite end of the spectrum from the emotional self-sacrifice of the hero or the martyr. Yet there are times when the perhaps unsophisticated self-dedication of the hero is more essential than the sarcasms of the clever." End quote. I think this actually marks a lot of probably how Glubb thought himself. Because he was a military man, I think he did side with the age of pioneers and conquest. He was a man of action, right? He was a man in World War I and that lived in action in serving the Iraq governments and Transjordan military. So I think over his lifetime, he developed that kind of idea that action dominates thinking for the most part. So it's no surprise that he kind of paints the hero as somewhat more essential than say the uninterested or stoic thinker.
Yeah, I think his critique of this age of intellectualism really aligns with another famous thinker, Friedrich Nietzsche's critique of Socrates in his work Twilight of the Idols. I believe it's in Twilight of the Idols. And Nietzsche's critique of Socrates almost aligns perfectly with Glubb's critique of the intellectualism stage of an empire. And Nietzsche basically said that Socrates was the harbinger of Greek cultural decline. And this was because, Socrates was famous for critiquing the gods, and at least he was accused of critiquing the gods and not believing in the Greek gods. And he basically had nothing to replace these foundational cultural touchstones with. All of Greek society was founded around the idea of the gods and divine fate. Socrates' answer was just pure rationality. And so Nietzsche basically says Socrates was, one of the beginning of this Greek cultural phase of decline, because he tore down these touchstones of Greek culture and replaced it with nothing. And that aligns perfectly, I think, with Glubb's quote there, where he says the unsophisticated self-dedication of the hero is more essential than the sarcasms of the clever. So Nietzsche might say that Socrates' worldview was the sarcasms of the clever.
Right, yeah. One's the nation builder, the other's more or less the nation destroyer for the most part. It also reminds me a lot of the New Atheists of the early 2000s, right? They did a lot of talking, a lot of convincing and tearing down of the religious foundation of, at least heavily in the Americas, but widely throughout Europe as well. But didn't really have anything to replace it with. So they're kind of serving a similar role as the intellectual and the age of the intellect, or Socrates in ancient Greece. That moves us
One
into
thing,
our last stage here of stage 6, the age of decadence. It's a big one, and it's the one that, of course, garners the most interest from most people, as most would probably agree that we're likely in a stage similar to this now. But it's characterized by a slew of symptoms, which many of you listening will think sound a little bit too familiar now. So, Adam, why don't you take us through some of those main symptoms of this final stage?
yeah, the first symptom that Glubb talks about is internal division. And he really already touched on this in the Age of Intellect. And that's because it's a direct outgrowth of this worldview. This questioning of all the foundations that made the empire great in the first place. And with this comes sort of a pessimism and a nihilism for the future. Again, you've torn down the cultural landmarks and great ideas of the empire, and there's not much to replace them with. So there's a general nihilism that pervades this stage of the empire. So with this, you have not just philosophical nihilism, but political disagreements and political arguments, demonstrations, boycotts. These are all very prevalent during this last stage of the empire. And what's important to note is that even if external threats are confronted, they are not things to unify around. So often we believe, if we have some great enemy, the people of the civilization will unify because they'll recognize this existential threat. But this is not the case, and Glubb points to the Byzantine Empire, whereas the Ottomans were basically on the doorstep of Constantinople, and they still couldn't find real political unity and were marked by civil strife and wars of legitimacy. So he says, empires decline amidst a cacophony of argument. So again, this disagreement, these shouting matches in parliament. And this all boils down to the idea that happened in the age of affluence, where the idea of self-sacrifice itself has long been absent from the people of the empire. And it's only been replaced by self-interest. And a final note in this stage, for this symptom, is that there's a general loss of civility. And normally there are social norms and etiquette that people of the empire treat each other with, but this begins to break down as their political disagreements and philosophical and religious disagreements are exacerbated. So Glubb notes that even during his own day, people of parliament were traditionally, there's a sacredness of the House of Parliament. People treated each other as gentlemen. However, he began to see it devolve into shouting matches, loud noises, slurs were thrown at each other within the Houses of Parliament. And this cultural sacred place lost its sacredness and it became vulgar, just like the rest of society. Now, the second symptom for this phase of empire is a large influx of foreigners. Now, this is a natural development, sort of the fact that it is an empire. So with an empire, you have a large swath of land that encompasses many different types of people. So in the Roman Empire, you were stretching from Spain all the way to Persia, and from Great Britain all the way down south to North Africa. So you have tons of various peoples already within the empire, and especially during the age of commerce, these people begin to travel frequently back and forth. And they especially congregate, of course, in the capital and the great cities of the empire. But what this ends up doing is it exacerbates the already present political divide. So every group has their own preference. They come often from different religious backgrounds and social backgrounds, and they all begin to form their own enclaves within these cities, which just overall increases the internal division of the empire.
Right. Yeah, and then yeah, for sure. I mean, we all, obviously that's a political issue today, but it's just a fact that Glubb notes that the capital cities of the empires are inherently metropolitan. They've got people from all over the world. That's the center of trade. So it's just a natural consequence of having power and being a force in the world and attracting the eyes of people from all the neighboring nations and across the globe, as you're basically a great signal post for opportunity. But another, kind of symptom of the age of decadence is materialism and frivolity. So Glubb claims that the frivolous mindset is at its root a form of pessimism or nihilism. And he actually cites St. Paul's proclamation that life is meaningless if not underpinned by a deeper metaphysical truth. Otherwise, you have to live by a philosophy of, eat, drink, be merry, and because tomorrow we're going to die. So the Roman mob famously demanded bread and circuses, right? There's free food and public games, gladiatorial battles, chariot races, and athletic events were, coining another term, the opium of the masses. Another problem besides that, which we're all quite familiar with today, we might think of, all the vast amounts of content out there on the internet now, right? We can watch Netflix until our eyes bleed. We have all the bread and circuses we need. We even have the free food if you need it. But another problem that surprised me was the influence of celebrities, which certainly we see today. It's quite obvious. But what surprised me is that this is a problem going back much, much farther. So Glubb describes how the Arab leadership in Baghdad had a problem with the popular singers of the time because they had kind of an outsized influence. I can only suspect partially politically during their time as well. So these singular singers in Baghdad, but entertainers of various kinds, right, generally get their own following, right? They get kind of a cult following, and then their words can sometimes come to blows with that of the leadership, and that becomes a problem for said leadership. And so Glubb notes that the heroes of the declining nations are always the same archetypes, more or less. There's athletes, singers, and actors, and that's entirely true of today, but also truer of past societies more than we might think. Another sign of this materialism and frivolity is there's a decreased morality in general, right? So it comes, of course, with a decline in religion, naturally. But one mark of that is use of obscene language, something also the Arab leadership had a problem with at the time and tried to crack down with. And then Glubb also notes another influence that they've battled in the past is, controversially, the influence of women in public life. So Glubb writes here, quote, "Although Rome ruled the world, women ruled Rome." That was kind of a well-known pithy statement that some of the late Roman historians or later medieval historians had noted. So Rome was at this time, late Rome had an increase in leadership of women, and the conclusion is that it was only shortly after this that it was overrun by foreign invaders. Whether that's a fair connection or not, it doesn't really matter. It's just a mark of a late stage empire at this point, whether good or bad, whether right or wrong. And then lastly, on the same point, no effort is made to save the nation, kind of like we touched on before, because the citizens no longer believe the empire is worth saving. They rest in inaction, so they don't rally around the common cry to save their nation, as their interests have completely turned inward rather than toward the good of society. And I think something Glubb didn't note here, at least that I recall, is that another sign of that same apathy is kind of a self-saving tendency, right? There tends to be a flee from the empire in its final stages before it crumbles, right? You saw this in any of the wealthy nations in Europe, especially through the world wars. There's always an exodus of the wealthy elites before the crash finally comes. And so that comes along with the weakened economy, which is often the driving factor there, right? It's usually the exodus comes from a protection of wealth standpoint. And so the weakened economy which had already begun kind of in the previous stage, but really comes to fruition now, and the crash is finally seen by the wider public, whereas previously maybe it was only seen by the visionaries, right? It's accelerated by, counterintuitively more comfortable working conditions in some cases, right? The U.S., I'd say it's harder to see that, right? But overall, right, our working conditions have only become more comfortable, whereas our economy certainly is showing cracks now. And the same was seen in Baghdad's earlier days. So another thing that surprised me is that Baghdad had introduced a 5-day work week during their heyday. And this occurred squarely in the years when their economy was widely declining. So instead of rallying to revitalize the nation, people generally seek comfort in the decline, which is another mark of the age of decadence. Along with that comes the welfare state, of course. So Glubb was acutely aware of this as the United Kingdom was developing its welfare state during his later years. But the age of decline tends to show a philanthropy and sympathy to other peoples that maybe it's too late in its decline to reasonably do. So Glubb writes, quote, "As long as it retains its status of leadership, the imperial people are glad to be generous, even if slightly condescending," end quote. We see that a lot today, actually, with some charities that perhaps are only generous from a kind of selfish standpoint. Maybe they want the tax incentives offered by a 501c3, but they also operate in somewhat of a condescending method, like, oh, these people are too poor to understand how to, acquire their own clean water. We have to do it for them. That kind of mentality. It actually reminds me a lot when you have a quite well-off friend or neighbor who just loves to entertain, right? They have the huge entertainment space in their backyard, and they view it as kind of I'm giving my backyard to my friends and neighbors by having them over and, kind of wine and dining them. So it's kind of that, I don't know, kind of ingenuous philanthropy that it reminds me of. So what they perceive as generosity might really be a sort of pride or vanity. So we see that even today. And another impression is that the empire will always. Let me back up there. Another impression is that the empire will always be rich, and that ironically spurs its population to spend more lavishly in its decline. So because we don't really see the collapse coming, and we see the affluence of our previous decades, we continue to spend even though the economy is weakening and collapsing. And we see that today, of course, right? The economy is certainly in decline, but yet people will still come out with brand new cars despite the exorbitant price tags on them today. And then lastly, the welfare state might just, you can think of like when the welfare state arises in the age of empires, but it generally seems to mark the end of an old empire at this point. You can only get to a welfare state when you're wealthy and powerful enough to afford it, and then even then you can only afford it for so long.
Yeah. So the next stage the next symptom, I should say, of this age of decadence is weakening religion. And if the symptoms up until now haven't sounded familiar, then this one certainly will. But Glubb basically makes the point that decadence itself is ultimately a spiritual sickness. And it results from too long a period of wealth and power, and this shift from duty and honor to personal gain and making money. And basically the habits of the community are corrupted by money and power for too long, and the people become selfish and idle, and they don't know what to do with themselves anymore. They're already rich, but there's no overarching impetus for the civilization itself, so community begins to fall apart. And of course, this sounds very familiar today. We've had a declining religion for now 50 years at least. So it seems like it goes hand in hand with the nihilism that has spread during the age of intellect and this overall pessimism. But he does note that there are signs of a rebirth during this time sometimes, whereas a faithful band of people maybe are more dedicated to their religion than the civilization had ever been before, maybe because they recognize the decadence around them, they often hold on to a stronger form of the religion or even a new religion. And of course, the example of this would be in Rome. You had the suffering of the martyrs, and they were holding on to this new way of life amidst the decadence of the great Roman Empire. So basically, Glubb is saying that all is not lost despite this nihilism and pessimism that is pervading the empire and this general decline in religionness. There are often seeds of rebirth within that period. But just to wrap up here, the symptoms of this age of affluence. The last symptom, we've touched on it before, is a defensive mindset. And again, it's just an inward looking. We want to protect our wealth and our decadence, but we don't have the strength anymore to conquer more countries or expand the empire. So we close in on ourselves, build walls, and defend ourselves as best we can against the oncoming barbarian hordes. But I just want to restate these symptoms once again for clarity of what are the symptoms of the age of decadence, because they are so familiar. So the first is internal division. The second is an influx of foreigners. The third is materialism and frivolity. The fourth is a weakening economy. The fifth is a weakening religion. And finally, the sixth is that defensive mindset. And the age of decadence basically brings our empire to full cycle. It's the last stage of the empire. So afterwards, you're either going to have barbarians or new age of pioneers from a different empire pop up and start to encroach upon this empire, or it will just generally decline over the next decades.
Right. Now that we've come to the full end of the cycle, we can ask ourselves, where are we today? So I think that's the most interesting question for most people is, where in this cycle does the United States, or name your country, where are they today? So the first thing to note, though, is that not all nations will go through this. So you can't necessarily apply Glubb fairly to any nation in Europe or the broader world, for example, because Glubb really only applied this to empires. So I think it's really only fair to apply that to the United States today. To small nations, Glubb is pretty unsure. He opens the door that it might be possible they go through similar cycles, but he notes also that they might be more self-contained and thereby perhaps more stable. So the decadence, he notes, comes from really too long a periods of wealth and power. And if your small nation simply doesn't share in that wealth and power for any significant time, they likely won't share in its decadence. So it won't go through these later stages. And of course, it hasn't become an empire in the first place, so it hasn't really reached the age of commerce and age of affluence in the first place. Nonetheless, the U.S. is undoubtedly the empire of the current times. The current power at large, and so we might ask ourselves, where in the cycle do we fall today? So I think what I'll present here is a brief outline of just one idea about maybe how the United States has progressed as an empire. Totally open for debate. So if you have disagreements, please share them in the comments. All this, as Glubb notes, they're quite loose definitions, right, of when the ages start and stop. So to some degree, if you'll notice, a lot of these different ages and stages in the cycle will overlap to a great degree as well. So they don't necessarily need to line up edge to edge between, say, the age of pioneers and conquest. There's no clean break there for the most part. So there can be a decade or more overlap between any two stages. And you also might note that the stages don't necessarily have to be equal in length either. There's no reason you simply need to take 250 divided by 6 and find your windows for when each stage should occur in. They can, one could be quick at 20 years, and the other could be 100 years in some cases. So the rates of progression through the stages aren't fixed, and Glubb doesn't say much about that in the first place. But Okay, if we were to come up with a toy timeline for maybe how the United States has progressed, I'd put the age of pioneers as starting at around the mid 1780s through, and then progressing through the early 1800s. So in that time period, you've had the Declaration of Independence, the Revolutionary War was won, and the Constitution signed. And so you've really seen more of a pioneering, in my opinion, of a new model of governance. And it's a little bit different than most because it starts off as a colony. It's not really pushing into new territory. It doesn't have large powers all around it to conquer, per se. It has other colonies of other powers far off in Europe. So it is in a little bit of a unique situation as opposed to previous empires, which were large, landlocked by other powers or generally surrounded by many independent nations or other empires. And so then I would put the age of conquest at around the 1800 mark to 1850s mark. These stages are somewhat intermixed because of that U.S. outgrowth as a colony of its initial adversary. So again, I think the lines are a little bit blurred there. But the reason I think that this is the age of conquest is it's in this age, so only shortly before actually 1789 that a standing army was established. So you see that professionalism creeping in to the early United States once it becomes a bona fide nation. You also see a large expansion of territory, right? You see the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. You see Lewis and Clark expeditions, though they didn't actually expand territory per se, but they were the exploratory arm of that, right? The initial exploration of the West for the United States at large. And then you have increased continuous wars to kind of solidify the nation overall. So you have the War of 1812. You have the Mexican-American War establishing the United States in kind of the Western Mexican territories. And then I kind of conclude it with the Civil War ending in 1865, which is, something I would like to go back and ask Glubb, if we could, where Civil War fits in to the overall stages of empire, because to some degree it's a crisis, right, of itself. It seems to fit into something much later, in a much later stage, like the age of decadence, when things have fallen apart. But as we can see, that didn't tear the United States apart. The United States recovered quite quickly after the Civil War, and the empire, we weren't quite an empire at that point. So then we move into the age of commerce, which is coincident with really the Industrial Revolution. And so this is another point where it's kind of hard to pinpoint, right? Because the Industrial Revolution was global. It wasn't just in the United States. It was largely started in Europe for the most part. But it corresponds with this same period in the United States, say 1850s through the 1920s. In this period that you had the California gold rush, so we're discovering new wealth, right? And that exploratory arm, that energy of the age of conquest and the age of pioneers is now put into how do we make more money? And so the gold rush was an opportunistic adventure out to the West to find that wealth. You also have the Civil War here. So maybe the lines are a bit blurred here, but you have a battle over states' rights and the commercial impact of slavery on the South. So maybe there could be an argument that the Civil War fits into a battle over how we operate commercially, right? Are we going to operate with slave labor or not? And so to some degree, there's a philosophical battle on how we should operate our businesses, particularly those in the South. And then, of course, you have the Industrial Revolution itself, proliferation of steam engines, invention of cars, the assembly line with Henry Ford. All those things come to fruition to make the United States generally a wealthy nation at this point. And then that gets into the age of intellect, which I put here as 1880s to 1940s, roughly. This is actually the moment we have a lot of universities founded in the United States. So a lot of the land-grant state universities are birthed in the late 1800s. You also have pervasive radio and TV as a result of the technological progress achieved to this point. So we're going to begin lots of talking here. And then the intellect and commerce overlap a bit, of course, but you can think of this time also as a great time of patrons to not necessarily the artistic modes, which are generally seen in the age of commerce, but more into the libraries and museums. So, right, those monuments to knowledge in general. I'm just kind of reinforcing the intellectual nature of the United States at this point. And then moving to stage 5, the age of affluence, I put as a relatively large range from 1950s to 2000. So it's the post-World War II boom. It's a population boom. We're benefiting off of much of the debt that we lent to the United Kingdom to make us wealthy, unfortunately, at the expense of the British Empire. And then we defeated the main geopolitical enemy of the United States in the USSR. So we've kind of solidified our global power, and become wealthy there in the 90s to follow. But all that wealth and power then goes to our head in the age of decadence, and we see a series of financial bubbles, right? We have the dot-com bubble. So I'm saying this is starting at around 2000. The dot-com bubble, 2008 crisis, COVID precipitated a financial crisis all of its own. Now people are talking about, are we in an AI bubble? Housing costs have skyrocketed for young Americans. There's, on the political side, there's no, we haven't seen any recession in the divide between conservative and liberal political ideologies. It's only gotten worse, right? And then we have all the social maladies, of course, the decline in religion, although maybe that's hitting a turning point here. But, I see a lot of the social maladies kind of accelerated by the internet. So it's hard to gauge when these new technologies come in. Glubb, right, famously said that earlier, like we talked about, that the technologies don't really matter so much for the progression through these. But it seems hard to believe that, the internet doesn't have a tremendous effect in the age of decadence and accelerating it. But that's an open question, perhaps.
Yeah, it's an interesting thought experiment. I'd be very intrigued by our listeners what their timeline of the United States, or pick an empire, pick your favorite empire, and break it down into these 6 stages. It's just an interesting thought experiment to see if it really aligns with Glubb's theory here, or you disagree with that. So definitely post a comment if you have any thoughts on that. Another question Glubb touches on that I thought was really interesting is sort of the pros and cons of empires. We live in an age where empires are certainly seen as a bad thing. And maybe that goes back to Glubb's point of it's in the age of affluence that a people begin to view empire as wicked. And so that's certainly the case in the modern Western world. But he makes a few points that indicate empires are not always a bad thing, and they can produce goods for the world. So the first point he makes is that empires can be an economic boon for the greater region, or the region that the empire encompasses. And that's because they produce such stability in the regions, right? So they've conquered a large swath of territories. And then within that territory, and even often the surrounding regions, they're able to prevent wars because of their relative power. And this leads to, a great boom in global commerce, peace and security throughout the region. Often it's a spread of culture and a great renaissance of culture. And so even small nations can benefit from this. And particularly in the case of sea powers, he says that they often don't have the drawbacks that land powers do. So land powers, of course, have to conquer many, the entire region that they encompass. It's through conquest that they actually capture those regions, which, of course, is not great for the people being conquered. However, with sea powers, if you have a large enough navy, you can control large portions of the globe and secure international waters so that trade within those waters is peaceful and secure, and you don't have to worry about pirates. And he quotes the British Empire, basically. He says, Britain grew rich, but she also made the seas safe for the commerce of all nations and prevented major wars for 100 years. And so he basically makes the point that empires need not always have this dark lens put over them. They can actually be a boon for civilizations. And he says that, maybe it's the opportunity for people to share their gifts and greatness with the world for a period of time. And because they rise and fall, each people almost gets a chance, it seems, to share their greatness with the world. And they each get a turn, and then they decline, and then the new people can take the reins of power. I'm not sure if I agree with that sentiment, but it's interesting to think about that. Maybe there is this sort of divinely guided force that's allowing each people to have their turn at greatness on the world stage.
Right. We all hope that if we're in the new empire, ours is the one that lasts forever. But yeah, so that gets us to another interesting question, which is there hope for preventing a progression through the stages of empire? Say we both live in the American empire now. Is there a way that we can stop it? Stop at the high parts, right, of that progression in the stage of empires. So Glubb notes, and he has some thoughts on this. He notes that, first you got to understand the driving force between the stages. It's not any built-in law per se. It's changes in popular fashion. It's kind of the mood of the population that moves us through the different stages without real logical reason. And this popular enthusiasm kind of leads you through different stages, like the devotion to military glory in the beginning, but then it moves into wealth, and then it moves to academic fame, and then it moves into decline. And so Glubb does think there may be some means of preventing the activist age of conquest and commerce from deteriorating into the age of intellect. But his main medicine here is education and awareness. So typically that's the medicine given by any writer, but it's hard to see anything more than that, if I'm being honest. So if the public sees the cyclical nature, he argues, maybe the policies could be supported that maintain the spirit of duty and self-sacrifice. And this would forestall the accumulation of excessive wealth and subsequent demoralization of the nation. Now, he knows, just like I think most people suspect, that it's very unlikely that this collective ethic will ever outweigh the individual one. And so he's pretty doubtful that human nature will really make that happen. And I would share those doubts as well. So Glubb then considers that maybe the world is better by this turning of empires, like you mentioned. And he points out, right, that we have the arts and sciences from all these different places to enjoy now that they did rise and fall. And so they have benefited the world by that turning. But I'll kind of conclude this section with one of his concluding quotes here. Perhaps, in fact, we may reach the conclusion that the successive rise and fall of great nations is inevitable, and indeed a system divinely ordained, like you'd mentioned. But even this would be an immense gain, for we should know where we stand in relation to our human brothers and sisters. If we could accept these great movements as beyond our control, there would be no excuse for our hating one another because of them. End quote. And so his main point there is, yes, not only that it might be a good in itself that empires rise and fall for the benefit of the world, but also that in knowing that, we know that every empire is temporary. And so we need not look on other empires with envy and hate, because they're going to fall too eventually. And it's just a cycle of empires in the modern age. But now let's move on to some of the questions from some listeners that we have collected here today. So the first is kind of in line with the last question that we posed, right? So we posed a question, and Glubb partially answered, is there a way to prevent the progression through the stages of empire? But going further than that, Memory Medieval asks, has any society reversed this trend?
That's a great question, and Glubb actually does touch on this a little bit. He basically says that the remedy for reversing the trend is, in certain cases, by taking a population of the greater civilization that's in the decline phase and putting it in a completely new environment where then it can become maybe hardy once again. So you can think of colonization, basically, of the British Empire. where you'd have a bunch of young men that were brought up in wealth and decadence, but then you put them in Africa or North America, and it's a tough new environment for them to adapt to, and they basically become more like the age of pioneers because they're forced to confront the elements, maybe new civilizations they're coming into contact with, and it's kind of a reversal in the micro. And some examples of this would be like Rhodesia, Australia, even South Africa. And even the American colonies kind of fit this mode where you had a bunch of young men from Great Britain that were put in this new environment, and they became the creators of a new civilization. So they kind of restarted the cycle just by being in a completely new environment.
To some degree, it's not like we reversed it for the larger empire, right? It's kind of only reversed for those new colonies, at least in the case of the British Empire. It's kind of like just starting from scratch again, while the larger empire likely continues to go through its stages.
Right. So with that, it would almost indicate that the larger empire might be doomed to go through this cycle. However, the people within the empire can have hope by finding new frontiers to conquer, basically.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. You can separate out the people from the institution of the empire to some degree. All right. Second question from the Bryce Wade. How can the West reverse this decline? Similar question. And what needs to be done to defeat the burgeoning communist technocracy being built by China and the oligarchy? I'll say specifically, right? So whether we can reverse it or not is an open question. But as Adam suggested, there are maybe some hope for the people themselves kind of revitalizing and returning to a previous stage if put in the right conditions. But in terms of just how can the West be saved in general, right? What can we do to defeat the places like China and Russia and these adversaries that are creeping up on the U.S. hegemony over the world? There's really no easy answer here, of course, but I touch on one of this in an upcoming video. One point that I want to make here is just a matter of mathematics in populations, right? So in this video coming up, I talk about the importance of having children for saving the West. And it's just a fact that a population looks drastically different in 250 years, right? The lifetime of the average empire. If a society has 2 children or 5 children on average, the society that produces 2 children per family on average is dying, slowly, but dying. The society with 5 children on average grows exponentially. It's not even close. In 7 generations, you have a population of 15,000 if every one of those families resultant from that initial, 7 generations of ancestors has 5 children. Those that have more children generally see their ideals grow in the world. So naturally, you have an increasing power in the world by having more children, effectively, as long as those ideals are translated down the generations, which is challenging in itself. And those that have fewer will see their ideas die, just based on the pure democracy or at least democratic republic style governments of today. So now let's move on to our third question from Arminius. Explore the overlap of declining and ascending civilizations. For example, as ancient pagan polytheism was declining in the first millennia, Christendom was ascending in the West. So I'll answer first here. Glubb did note a little bit on this subject. So he noted that that the decline of one nation may be the impetus for a smaller nation to take action. So effectively signaling, right, I'm the weak antelope, and the cheetah or lion or whatever that's lurking nearby, waiting to overtake the now weak antelope is going to strike when he finds the most opportune moment. So a falling nation is a signal to its rivals that now's the time for action. So if you put this into geopolitical terms today, right, if China sees the Western hegemony falling, right, it's only a matter of time before they make a move to establish themselves as the new empire. And so when one nation nears the end of the age of decadence, which is something quite visible for everyone to see, especially in the age of telecommunications and internet, It's time to watch out for those nations who would appear poised for their own age of pioneers or conquest.
So another thinker I think it would be useful to bring into this conversation is Arnold Toynbee. And he has the idea that in declining civilizations, the people begin to adopt certain mindsets that either propel them to birth something new or basically just continue the decline. And he says that people amid declining civilizations have three overarching mindsets that they adopt. The first is detachment or abandonment, where they adopted ideologies that basically remove them from the equation of the civilization. These are often philosophies like Stoicism or Epicureanism, where they're really focused on the internal state of the people, but they're not as focused on action in the greater world. The second mindset is utopianism, and these are ideologies that promise greatness, promise rebirth, but they never deliver. And you can think of like communism or fascism of the 20th century that have these grand promises but lead to destruction. But the third mindset that the people have is what Toynbee calls transcendence. And this is where the people sort of channel the decline and channel the decadence of the culture into something new. But really, what they're doing is channeling the suffering and the hardship that's beginning to come with the decline. So, as things get harder, the economy weakens, borders collapse, you are presented with these hardships and suffering. And Toynbee says the only way to birth something new is to channel that. And of course, the example you gave is the perfect example with the declining pagan polytheism and the decadence of Rome. Within that, you have the martyrs who are suffering, and they're actually embracing their suffering. And by embracing this suffering and actually taking joy in it, in many cases, it's growing their movement even greater than it would be if maybe they ran and fled and hid out in the enclaves. So it's this idea that the seeds of a new culture are often within the dying, decadent culture. And it might take centuries to come to fruition, as Christendom did, right? It took a whole dark age, as what is commonly referred to as the Dark Age, was a couple 100 years, 300 years or so, before you have the birth of the Holy Roman Empire, which is Christendom taking the main stage in Europe. But I think that's a good place to maybe wrap up. Christian, do you want to sign us out?
Yeah, and just to say, thanks everyone for the questions. And if you have questions that you would like answered on the future episodes, be sure to leave them in comments or look out for a post from us on YouTube or any of the social platforms soliciting some of those questions. With that wraps up this episode. And if you like this discussion, help us out by liking, leaving a comment with your thoughts. Let us know how you think the stages line up to the current U.S. empire. And be sure to subscribe to get more content like this. Also, if you can, go check out our Substack where we post on history, culture, and literature. Until next time.